Contracts are the least of this industry's problems.
That's a statement right there. It kind of reminds me of just building any other business at this point. It's like you have to have systems and processes to make things more efficient.
We know the answers in terms of what we have to do. It just takes a lot of political will. People always talk about contracts. We got to do contracts faster.
This is Trial and Error, where we dive deep into the world of clinical trials, uncovering the challenges, breakthroughs, and stories behind the scenes. I'm your host, Ellis, and in this episode, we speak with Istvan around budgeting and contract negotiations. Clinical trials are the backbone of advancing medical care, yet the administrative hurdles of getting sites started up and getting patients through the door often slows down progress. Istvan is currently a director within Huron's research office. The research office services include research contract negotiations, clinical trial budget negotiations, pre-award proposal preparations, post-award financial management services, among many others. Istvan brings over 10 years of progressive research administration experience. Prior to joining Huron, Istvan worked at the University of Chicago for 6+ years on all types of research-related agreements in the position of Assistant Director of Contracts Management. Istvan is very familiar with federal acquisition regulations and the Federal Demonstration Partnership Subcontract DTUA templates, and he's also developed numerous systems and processes to increase contract processing efficiency and decreasing contract turnaround times. In this episode, we cover how differences between the ways protocols are represented and key omitted information during the budgeting stage often slows down the budgeting and contracting process more than people expect. And with that, I bring you episode 3. Hey, Istvan.
Hello, good morning, Ellis.
Good morning to you too on this lovely Saturday morning. Not a typical
That's how dedicated we are, folks, to this topic. We're doing this on Saturday morning, so I just want to put that out there.
Indeed we are. And I guess for the folks who are tuning in for the first time, I obviously give an intro about myself, but the whole point of this podcast is to make sure that we can get out really important information just about how to make trials run better. And here with me today, we have Istvan, who is a professional with a long time experience in budget and contracting, here to educate us on all manners of how to write budgets and contracts to get your turnover quicker. So with that, Istvan, would you mind introducing yourself a little bit for everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Istvan Fekete. Feel free to call me Ish. That's what most people end up doing. I've been working in this space now for going on 12 or 13 years. Started my career at the University of Chicago working in their Central Research Administration office, primarily focused on research contract negotiation, which included all of the clinical trials the university conducted. And then I came over to Huron Consulting. Reason for that switch is when I ran my contracts team at the University of Chicago, and I bring this up because I think this phenomenon is true for many parts of the clinical trial administration process. You know, when we would be understaffed, the solution would be, that's okay, Ish, just do 2 or 3 jobs until you hire somebody and train them, and then we'll be good to go. And you find that, you know, same thing in the budget space and the coverage analysis space and the regulatory coordinator space, right? You're running into the exact same type of issues. And so Huron was starting a group where their clients could leverage services to provide some of those administrative functions. And I thought to myself, well, I wish there was a solution out there like that for contracts. So instead of having to do 2 or 3 jobs, I could, you know, leverage a service like that. And so I came here and I've been working on building that service for the last 5+ years. And because our team does all this other work, I've also got my hands into all the other administrative components that are part of the study activation process, and then the post-award process, chart segregation, invoicing, you know, all that kind of stuff. So at this point in my career, I've seen, you know, many things, having worked with 50+ clients across the country and all the different ways of doing things. And so I'm hoping, you know, that your audience can benefit from some of that experience via the podcast.
Amazing. And one thing that I frequently find, including myself, is that most people, some people do, but a lot of people didn't intend on getting into the clinical research industry. It was something that kind of happened to them. Was that the case for you? How did you end up in this wonderfully interesting and complex business that we all work in?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I had a part-time job in my senior year of college where I was a law clerk part-time. Just, you know, Back then, I found that job on Craigslist, believe it, believe it or not. And, you graduate college and it's like, now what? Oh, okay, I have a job. I guess I'll be a law clerk full-time for $9.50 an hour with no benefits. And, from there, I got right. I got a paralegal job. And from there, I got a job negotiating IRS and state tax debts on behalf of clients. And that's where I really started to hone my negotiation chops, so to speak. And then from there, I applied for a job at the lowest rung of the University of Chicago's contracting team because I didn't know anything about research. I had never negotiated contracts before. And so I started off doing things like material transfer agreements and confidential disclosure agreements. CDAs are a huge part of the clinical trial process. And from there, worked my way up, became the assistant director there and got, exposure to the clinical trials. They do when I was there, about 200 to 240 new studies a year. And the University of Chicago I think it's a great training ground for this kind of thing because they do a lot of unique studies. Like I did a study where we were the United States sponsor, and then we had partnered with a Polish organization that was the European sponsor, and there were two pharmas involved. One decided to contract directly with the European sponsor and us. So they had two separate contracts, and then one only wanted to contract with us in the U.S. and have us sub to the Polish organization. We had another one that was funded by the National Institute of Health, the Susan G. Komen Foundation. There was a pharmaceutical company providing drug, and the study was taking place in West Africa, right?
Oh,
and
wow.
So I bring that up because, through that experience, I was able to participate in some complex trial designs. And I think that really trained me well to work in the space I am now, where we continue to work on complex trial designs. And it's good to have that experience to fall back in on. So yeah, completely fell into it, right? Just a random series of events. I like negotiating, which was my initial kind of hook into the industry. But as you get involved, you really realize how important this is to like humanity. This is the process by which we improve medical care. And it's getting more and more complicated as time goes on, and it's something we as a society, we have to be cognizant of, because the last thing we want to do is retard the progress by which things can be brought to the market, right? The whole idea is that, we expedite that so we can give better treatment to patients. And so I think it's, when you talk to your friends, they're just like, what do you do? I don't understand, whatever. But it's such an important component of our society. And once you start to get your hands in it, you really find value in that like, okay, maybe we're unsung heroes, but we provide a very important kind of service for society.
Absolutely. And speaking of the progress, or rather the lack thereof, I know that, study startup and budgets and contracts can be the actual bane of any clinical operations professional when they're trying desperately to get their studies started. And you have a talk coming up soon at Magi where you'll be speaking about some of these pitfalls. Maybe we could start there. So I think everyone would probably want to understand better. We've all heard of some of these pitfalls at a very high level, but I think let's kind of get into some of those specific recommendations. But maybe an overview first, right? So what are kind of the challenges for the budget and contracting phase when it comes to sites, based off of how every single protocol is different, every contract is different, every budget is different? I mean, starting from the fact that all of them are different, but I'll pause there, Ish. Maybe you could help enlighten some of us.
Yeah, I'll what I was thinking, Ellis, is I'll say a little bit about the talk I'll give at Magi, and then I'll kind of start at the beginning of the study activation process, because there's budgeting and contracting pitfalls throughout
right?
The entire thing. So at Magi, the talk I'm specifically giving is about offering solutions to actual contractual impasses that are very common. I think that when you go to a lot of these talks, one side will say, well, this is what we like, and this is why we like it, and these are the concerns we have with the other side. And then the other side will say the same thing. But what they will not say is this is the deal that we need to get to both accept, or frankly, to say, in this situation, you're wrong, and in this situation, you're wrong. And so that's what we'll be talking about at the session is, frankly, who's right and who's wrong in terms of certain topics that are common points of contention. Of course, this is, somewhat subjective in terms of it's based on what I view as appropriate risk tolerance, right? And that's what a lot of this really comes down to, is what is your organizational risk tolerance? And I think a lot of the times, unfortunately, it's the worst case scenario that is preventing people from accepting a deal that is good enough 99.99% of the time, because that 0.001, is what's holding it up. And so I think we lose that a lot in negotiations in terms of really thinking about what is the risk that we'd be assuming by accepting a certain paradigm. So let's start with the protocol, right? That's the beginning of the study activation process. And fundamentally, there is no harmonization in terms of how protocols are written. There's no harmonization in terms of where you can find specific pieces of information within a protocol, right? How detailed protocols are about things about labs, how detailed protocols about how many follow-up segments there are going to be. There's ambiguity there. And so one of the things our team is working on here is developing a artificial intelligence solution that can extract that information from protocols in a consistent and digestible way. Because if you could do that, the entire study activation process becomes significantly easier, right? And so that's something we're developing. And now, what's the first step of all of this? The pharmaceutical company approaches the investigator. Hey, we have this study, or maybe the CRO approaches the investigator. We have this study. Would you be interested in reviewing the protocol and, taking a look? Then if the PI says yes, then they get the confidential disclosure and they have to route it to somebody to do something with it, right? And so you're relying on, in many cases, world-renowned doctors who actually have to see patients and have like a million other things to do to navigate this kind of initial point of entry to the institution, right? And so that, I think, is a delay in the activation process that we don't really ever talk about. How long does it take a PI to decide if they want to review a protocol? Once they get that CDA, how diligent are they about getting it into the correct person's hands so that CDA can be processed, right?
Not to mention that the correct person may or may not have anything to do with the clinical research department. They may just be dealing with another stack of CDAs.
That's
and
right.
You're just,
they
one
definitely
other fish.
are.
Yeah.
They definitely are, Alice. They're definitely dealing with a huge stack of CDAs, and this one is just going to be another one on that list. Then you have to negotiate the CDA, which, if you're good at it and both sides are diligent, you should be able to get that done in about 7 business days, a week, right? CDA is what, a page and a half?
Keyword is should. Where are people messing up?
Yeah, well, turnaround times, right? I mean, on our team, we have a mandated service level that within 48 hours of receiving a response, you have to turn it around, right? Now, on more complicated agreements, what that means is you maybe review it and say, okay, I got to have all these other conversations before I can revert a draft, but you let the other side know, hey, I looked at this, I got to do X, Y, and Z, whatever. On CDAs, there's no internal business decision-making that is happening. This is a rinse and repeat exercise. So you should be turning these things around fast. And so that's one of the biggest delays is how quickly you can turn around that draft. And then, you can be in situations where a CDA takes a month, and that makes 0 sense. You could be in situations where a CDA takes more a month, and somehow that makes less than 0 sense, even though I know that's not mathematically possible.
Are there specific clauses that people tend to find contentious, or they fight over for no good reason in the CDA?
It's really the same 5 things you're arguing about every single time. What is the governing law? Folks, let's just stay silent on governing law and CDAs and make all our lives, significantly easier. This is one of those risk things. How often are we suing each other under CDAs, right? And so to argue about governing law when the chances of litigation are so low, and if you're silent on governing law, yeah, it's an issue you might have to deal with if there's a suit, but you can figure it out in that 0.001% of time that it actually, happens. The other thing is the definition of confidential info, right? This is not to, pick one side over the other, but the pharmaceutical industry wants to make that definition extremely broad, right? Anything that we give you, anything that you see, anything that you think you may have seen is confidential information. And from the site's perspective, it's like, are we really just talking about the protocol? Like, what is this broad definition of confidential information? Can we kind of narrow it? And what's the truth? There's a reasonable person standard that's a fallback, right? That prevents this administrative burden of having to mark all confidential information. You say, all right, if you don't mark it, and a reasonable person would consider it to be confidential based on the nature of information or manner of disclosure, then we'll still consider it confidential information, right? And what else happens is CROs have a playbook. Okay, what their playbook says 100% of the time is if the site pushes a hard marking requirement on us, push back on that. That's not something we can agree to. And that's understandable, right? The concern is you have a scientist disclosing something, they don't mark it confidential, and now, you're out of protection. That does make sense, but they miss the fact that there's a reasonable person standard already there to address that concern, right? And so one of the things our team does is every time we make that edit, we put a comment that says, please note this is not a marking requirement. Because honestly, it prevents the pushback 30% of the time. You still end up getting it sometimes, and you have to point out, hey, I know, that's why I offered this to you. The other one that you argue about, but it's usually pretty easy, confidentiality cap. Pharma wants it as long as possible. Universities have a standard of 3 to 7 years. Why we don't just start at 7 and everybody accepts 7 and we move on with our lives, I really have no idea. But that's usually a pretty negotiation. They start with 10, you ask for 5, they counter with 7, and you say, cool. That's how that works out. And then the one that is perhaps most contentious is the warranty disclaimer of the confidential information, right? So what you're seeing more and more of now is the pharmaceutical industry is saying that we're providing you the protocol as is with no warranties of any kind. Review it at your own risk. Decide if you want to participate in this study at your own risk. And it's like, on one hand, you can understand that, right? Because there's no business being conducted under the CDA, right? The drug is experimental, and you can understand it from that perspective. On the other hand, the site is relying on that information to decide whether or not to participate in your trial. Forget things like, well, if you're disclaiming all warranties, does that mean you don't even have title to the protocol? What does that, really mean? And this is one of those things where I feel like it's an issue. It's a solution looking for a problem, meaning 8 years ago, I wasn't negotiating warranty disclaimers on CDAs hardly ever. Now it's an issue constantly, and our clients have different perspectives on what level of warranty disclaimer is appropriate depending on their, personal levels of risk tolerance, right? And, I would ask the pharmaceutical industry, how many times have you been sued because you didn't have a warranty disclaimer in a CDA under which you were disclosing a protocol, right? And this is one of those things where I'm like, what risk are we really protecting against here while injecting a contentious issue into the negotiation?
Right. Yeah, I guess it's like managing risk really far up front when, maybe the bigger business risk is not having your study start and hit the milestones it needs to, right? And so I guess to your point, yeah, if it's at the CDA level, business hasn't really been conducted. What's the real material risk here, right? Okay, so those are great CDA pitfalls. Hopefully the turnaround time is resolved. Now we're on to receiving the protocol, correct? Yep.
Yes, now we have the protocol, okay? Then the study team, if they say, no, we don't want to do it, that's the end of the conversation.
Well, yeah.
Simple enough. And what I think is discounted is how many studies are turned down because of staffing limitations at the site, right? I think there's a real issue in our industry with the position of the study coordinators. Mm-hmm. I think they're woefully underpaid, and I think the credit they are given in terms of the importance of this entire thing is grossly understated. Because for everything that we're going to talk about here, Ellis, none of it matters unless you have a functional study coordinator that is actually enrolling patients and, doing the things that they need to do. So they're a vital part of this. But site says, okay, we want to proceed with the study. Then the question becomes, does the site have any process by which they do their own feasibility, right? Once the site says we're going to proceed with the study, the other side is going to do feasibility and site selection, right? The pharmaceutical industry, because they don't want to spend money opening sites that aren't going to work for the study. But is the site doing its own feasibility? Is the site saying, based on our other studies, based on the priority of this study, based on our patient population, are they doing that analysis? And if they are doing that analysis, do they have a prioritization mechanism, right? Where certain studies can be deemed higher priority and have an expedited pathway as opposed to other studies that are deemed a lower priority. And the truth of the matter is, a lot of sites do not do this at all. And, some do some flavor of this and some do it well. Some do feasibility well. But I think that's a big gap in the industry in terms of study activation, is sites actually doing their own feasibility assessment. I remember I had a site talk to me and they said for their studies that they open, 60% they never enroll a single patient. Now, if you think about the cost of opening those trials without then any benefit, right, that's pretty astronomical. What you have to consider, and I had a conversation with a doctor about this that kind of opened my eyes to this, and he said, Ish, I can appreciate what you're saying, but I want to have the treatment available to my patient if I do have one that qualifies for the trial. And that's logic that's pretty hard to argue against, right? That's something that we have to take into account with all of this as well. But that feasibility is a huge component of this. And sorry, I'm looking over here to the right. I have some notes written down of points that wanted to hit. Then site proceeds with the study. Pharma says, okay, we're going to select you as a site. Then the documents are provided generally to the study team. And when I say documents, the regulatory package, the budgetary documents, the contract, the protocol, all that.
Can I actually just take a quick step back? So when we're talking about feasibility, right, you had, when we started some of this conversation with how the way that the protocol is represented, because it's missing key parts often, right? I know we're still at the CDA stage. It can make it difficult. So are there elements where kind of lack of standardization in the protocol just makes things harder to do feasibility?
Yeah, because what will happen is you won't realize that certain procedures are requiring certain pieces of equipment. So I can't tell you how many times it's happened where we think everything's good to go, and then it turns out, on visit 8, we need to do this thing. The protocol was pretty ambiguous about it. And now, not only, now we're going to need to amend the contract, amend the budget, this whole thing, because there was lack of clarity on what that procedure would entail at visit 8. So it does make feasibility more difficult from that perspective. You may not know a pricing quote that you need to get from a specific department within your institution, whether that's pathology or radiology or, hospital medicine, whatever department it is that you're dealing with. You may not know to do that until you're well into your negotiations, and then it pops up, that's actually happening under this protocol. Okay, well, now I need to go get pricing from so-and-so.
Oh, that's actually okay. So people say things like something is ambiguous often, and I totally understand. But can you maybe provide a very specific example? Like, is it something where it's in a footnote somewhere, they didn't provide the manual associated with it, and so the assessment just describes what the assessment description is what the assessment is, but not how the assessment is done. What would you say are pretty egregious examples of ambiguity where if any writers out there who are writing protocols are listening, maybe I can take a step back and ask themselves this question.
Labs is a huge one that there's a ton of ambiguity in these protocols. What labs are required? When are they required? And which ones would the patient undergo independent of participation in the study or not, right? Those components of a protocol are often ambiguous. And then the other part is optional procedures. And what the trigger is for the optional procedure is also oftentimes ambiguous in the protocol, right? And so what a protocol writer needs to consider is that what is the site doing eventually? They're building a billing calendar, right? That says at this visit, this patient is getting X done, triggering these specific bills, where these go to insurance and these go to the sponsor, right? So overall, when we speak about ambiguity, you need to be writing your protocol in a way that it aligns with that billing that is going to be happening down the line, and that would allow the site to build out a comprehensive calendar of schedule of events. And the protocols do have schedule of events, but it doesn't build it out to the same level of detail that is required in the clinical trial management system billing grids that, clients that have those things are using. So I really think if there could be harmonization between the schedule of events and in the protocols and the format of these builds in the CTMS systems, that would also go a long way towards addressing that ambiguity.
Got it. Okay, that was a little bit of a detour, but now we're talking about some of this reg doc, and getting into actual negotiations.
So again, here we go. We have another administrative component that the PI and their study team have to navigate. They get these documents dumped on them, and they now have to route them. And there's several departments that they're going to have to deal with. There is often a clinical trials office. That clinical trials office may or may not handle the contract. There's also the IRB, right? And so a lot of sites, and I actually do recommend this, is they practice concurrent routing, meaning that it's at the point of submission of the protocol to the IRB that's when the budget and contract begin to be worked on simultaneously. Why do I recommend this? Remember when I was talking about feasibility and prioritization? Submission to the IRB is perhaps the easiest way to create a prioritization mechanism. The problem with it is you're not really giving it a whole lot of thought. But the point being, the study team has their stuff together and is submitting to the IRB, right? Should not be behind the study team that has not gotten their stuff together and submitted the protocol to the IRB for review. So concurrent routing kind of gives you a nice first in, first out cadence, right? And so if you don't have a feasibility process, concurrent routing is one way you can kind of create a non-sophisticated prioritization mechanism. Now, documents get submitted. What should be happening in a most efficient process, IRB is reviewing the protocol, the site is conducting its Medicare coverage analysis, and the contract is being worked on. But sites have all kinds of weird contingencies in that process. Some people don't submit to the IRB until way down the line. Some people won't start working on the contract until the budget is. Some people won't start working on the budget until the contract is done. Some people start working on the budget before the coverage analysis is done, then do the coverage analysis, and then have to make all these changes to reconcile the two documents, right? And so really, best practice, study team gets the docs, submit to the IRB, submit to the clinical trials office that exists, or whatever central office is responsible for doing the budget and contract. And all three of these things are happening at the same time. And with the budget, you start with the coverage analysis first. Why? Coverage analysis is what dictates what you're going to bill to the sponsor and what you're going to bill to the insurance, right? You can understand how that's the building blocks of the budget, right? And so that should happen before you begin budget negotiations. And I think some sites think they're saving time by doing budgets before they do the coverage analysis. in the end, it becomes a nightmare. And remember, coverage analysis is meant to be a compliance mechanism, right? There's national coverage decisions, and then there's the 7 regions where there's local coverage decisions that tell you what you can bill to insurance and what you can't. And so if you're doing coverage analysis from a compliance perspective, then it should be what is dictating your budget negotiation thereafter. Now, one big problem with coverage analysis is study team input. One of the things I think we like to pretend like we can do in this industry is we can have everything be different and be efficient at the same time. That's not a thing, right? That standardization is the only way you gain efficiency. And so from a doctor's perspective, it's interesting because they'll say, oh, I want my studies activated quicker, but I also want to be able to review the coverage analysis and make changes based on my own personal interpretation of medical care. Well, not only does that delay the process, but it negates standardization and it lessens the compliance benefit your organization is receiving from even doing the coverage analysis, right? If you're billing PIA study one way and PIB study a different way, how do you explain that should you get audited, right? And so that process of study team input on the coverage analysis, that brings in a lot of inefficiency into the system. And of course, our team does a coverage analysis, in 7 to 10 business days, right? Ideally, the budget person could start right after that. When you interject a study team feedback loop into the coverage analysis thing, you're adding like a month,
Wow, that's a long time.
Sometimes it can do it faster, sometimes longer, but, about a month in time to the study activation process you're adding. Because then what happens when you get the study team feedback? Now you have to negotiate with the study team if they're trying to do stuff that is against institutional guidelines in terms of designations. And so that's a whole.
Outside of what you mentioned with kind of lack of information about labs and triggers for optional procedures, are there other things that kind of impact the coverage analysis as it relates to either ambiguity in the protocol or just general lack of standardization?
I think a lot of sites are not set up to have their billing process aligned with local coverage decisions and national coverage decisions, right? So they may lean towards billing more things to the sponsor, or they may lean towards billing more things to insurance. And so the organization's own perspective on how they do billing influences this, but also, their level of risk tolerance, meaning some organizations will, under the guise of good partnership with their investigators, assume more billing risk because of these differences under that premise. But what that does is it makes it harder to train good coverage analysts, budget negotiators, so on and so forth, because the designations are not standard. And they ask themselves this question, well, why is it this on this study and why is it this on this study? And wait till we get to congruency review at the end of this process, right? Where you have to have all these different documents align. And so those institutional level decisions are problematic somewhat in this space. The other thing, the other side of that coin is institutions that don't have any viewpoint on this stuff. And they just let their PIs make whatever changes that they want. And that's the extent of the exercise, right? And so when you have individual humans changing things based on their own interpretations, that means every study is arguably different. Even though you're doing the same procedure to relatively the same population, you're handling it in a different way, right? And each time you do that, you're creating a lack of standardization in your process, which makes it difficult for all the people you're relying on to do this work, right? And you also get into these positions where the institution, wants to tell the doctor no to something that they want to do to the coverage analysis. There's a ton of politics involved, and
Oh, wow.
it's not as, you would think it's as simple as being like, no, we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
Absolutely not that simple. It is much more of a politically driven process than I would have imagined going into it when it comes to investigators really feeling passionate about being able to provide this kind of feedback because, it's their patient's care, it's this, I'm not trying to belittle the desire on the side of the investigator. It's very logical, and I don't even want to say inappropriate. I think it's appropriate, level of involvement that they want. But we just as an industry have to really, really be cognizant of what the trade-offs of that are. And is it worth it for us as an industry to allow that level of feedback if our goal is truly rapid study activation? And that's one of the things I hear way more talk about rapid study activation than I see behaviors that are aligned with rapid study activation. It's become kind of this buzzword.
Yeah.
We know the answers in terms of what we have to do. It just takes a lot of political will and changing of the way you may have done business historically, and you got to deal with the blowback. When you do things like that, there is going to be blowback, and you need strong leadership who can deal with that blowback and appropriately navigate the institution to a better place. I think that strong leadership component of dealing with the blowback, that is lacking in a lot of scenarios, just to put it, frankly, because it's a difficult conversation to have. A lot of these leaders, the truth is the doctors have more power than them.
Right.
So it's a difficult, and the other leadership that they're dealing with generally also have more power than them. And so it's a difficult kind of position for the people who get put into that position to navigate from a change management perspective, but it's necessary.
You had mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, this concept of kind of this middle ground contractual passes. Is there a concept that you think exists here? Is there some concessions that, maybe you give this to the PI so that the organizational, efficiency can broadly be improved? Are there similar concepts here for the coverage analysis and everything?
I think there are, but my expertise in coverage analysis is not as high as it is in contracts. So I wouldn't want to talk about specifics in the way that I can on contracts. But I think what the best way to tackle that is to have institutionally documented positions and then educate your faculty on why that is the institutional documented position. When you talk about a middle ground, I think that's really it, because like I said, I think it's appropriate for PIs to review these things and have a viewpoint on how their patients are going to be treated, but there needs to be a institutional lens versus a individual doctor lens by which they are conducting that review, right? And too often it's left up to the physician's viewpoint on medical care solely, as opposed to the physician being educated on why the institution categorizes certain procedures in certain ways and bills for them in certain ways. So from an industry perspective, I think that's the best way for the sites to tackle this kind of issue, is to have strongly defined institutional positions and then justification and education that you can share with your physicians.
It's interesting. It's almost, it kind of reminds me of just building any other business at this point. It's like you have to have systems and processes to make things more efficient. And basically what you're saying is you have to avoid this desire to kind of treat everything as unique and special and individual as much as possible. Not to say that you can't do it, but rather you want to, draw the line so that you know where you're deviating, as opposed to having to redraw the line every single time, right? It's so funny how these fundamentals, they end up always...
They're true in every business.
Everywhere you look, right?
What? Yeah. And with, this is clinical trials at academic institutions, which, mind you, academic institutions are just one segment of the site population that is conducting clinical trials, but they're a big part of it, right? I mean, let's be real about it, right? And for them, this is lumped into the overall general premise of research administration. And for the entirety of my career, there has been this inherent conflict in research administration where we pretend like we can provide white glove service and we can do things efficient. And it's a make-believe premise, but to this day, it's a paradigm that a lot of folks are pretending like they can operate under, where we can both have customization and efficiency, and you can't.
Yeah, I see that as well. I think that in general, it's funny when people ask why are costs so expensive? And at the same time, the general unwillingness to allow for standardization because everything is unique and special. But
yes.
every deviation, not protocol deviation, but every deviation is a cost to the business, to the vendor providing the service. And, even if it's unintentional and it is important to you, it is a cost, right? And so that's where we kind of end up.
Yeah, and it's the time, the cost of time as well that I think is missed in a lot of these situations, is just a lack of acknowledging that each one of those things is elongating the study activation time, right? And, each thing adding, you have 100 things adding half an hour, these things start to really add up. And a lot of these decisions add way more time than half hour. Going back to where we are in the process, let's say we do concurrent IRBs looking at stuff. We're negotiating the clinical trial agreement. Coverage analysis is being done. And let's say we've now moved on to the budget negotiation process. People always talk about contracts. We got to do contracts faster contracts. Contracts are the least of this industry's problem. The reason contracts...
Really? That's a statement right there.
The reason contracts are a problem in this industry is because budgets are attached to the contract. If budgets were some independent document that had nothing to do with contracts, you could get contracts done fast, okay? What's one of the great things about clinical trial agreement negotiation, as opposed to other agreements in the research realm, is they were by far the most rules of the road and industry standards when it comes to clinical trial. By far. No other contract type in research is as defined in terms of what it needs to say as clinical trial agreement. And so because of that, the negotiations can happen more efficiently than in a lot of other areas in research. Because in a lot of other areas in research, nothing like that project has ever been done, and so you're really dealing with novel paradigms much more often in other aspects of research than you are in the clinical trial agreement space. So it's really the budget, all right? And the budget, this is not a political statement, but this is a factual statement. You know where budgets are easy to negotiate for clinical trials? Where you have nationalized healthcare, because the pricing is already determined prior to the budget negotiation. Right. Now, as we know about the American healthcare system, nobody has any idea what anything costs, okay? Sponsors are trying to figure it out by doing fair market value analysis, lots of pitfalls in that because hospital systems in the same region have very different prices, right? Does the patient know what it costs? No, the patient has no idea what things cost. Do the people negotiating the budget know what things cost? Kinda. Sometimes they may have a charge master that the hospital has given them that they can use to negotiate. But a lot of times there's ambiguity on the budget negotiated on what things cost. You think the study teams know what things cost? No, they have no idea what things cost. And so the inherent lack of transparency in healthcare pricing in this country is kind of the fundamental bottom line of why budget negotiations are as complex as they are. But then you get into things like institutions have 82 layers of approval in order to get a budget approved. And the sophistication of those levels of approval in terms of understanding the financial picture of a current budget that's on the table is, all over the map, from having no idea how to interpret the financials of a budget to being very sophisticated about interpreting the financials of a budget. And there's a lot of turnover in this industry, and so that kind of knowledge is lost by sight on a regular basis. And so the budget is the beast of this industry that creates the most delays in and of itself. And there's things you can, there's things you can do, like having standardized staff time estimates. Why does one nurse cost $80 an hour and the other costs $150 an hour? Is it just because that's what you're doing? Or do you have an actual justification that you can use to explain to the sponsor why the hourly charge for this exact same position is different on one study versus another study? Or your staff time estimate. Why are you saying this thing is going to take 10 hours on this study and this thing is same thing is going to take 6 hours on this study? You can do rate cards with the sponsor where you preemptively agree that these are going to be the prices for certain procedures, right, for the next 2 years. Do not do it for more than 2 years because, we saw what happened with inflation, right? The cost of medical care, just like everything else, right? So you as a site, you can't because the hospital is going to charge the site what the hospital is going to charge them regardless of what's in the rate card, And so you have to be cognizant of how long you're locking in these prices that you've negotiated with the sponsor. Now, you could build in inflationary increases, right, into the rate card to account for these things. And you see that on budgets, actually. And so the budget is the real boondoggle when we come to contract negotiations and why do we take so long. I can't tell you. Contracts reach budgets to the finish line almost always everywhere, right? We have a status in our system that's complete pending budget finalization because we have so many trials where the contract is done and the budget is still pending. And when I say pending, it can be for months after the contract is done that the budget is still being negotiated on. Another thing a site needs to do is have really strong justifications for the costs that they're asking for. And Ellis, why do you think that's hard for sites to do? Because they don't have transparency into the pricing themselves, okay? So it's a difficult thing to justify pricing that you're like, that's a great question. I don't know, but that's what it costs, okay? It's a tough spot to be in.
Are there, I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Fox, who you may be aware of, and I've talked to him on this topic quite a lot, and it is very challenging. I think he's working on solving similar problems. Do you think there are ways that the sponsor is maybe shooting themselves in the foot in this process, though? I can't help but think that there are contributing elements here.
The amount of times you have to justify the same exact thing to the same sponsor is honestly crazy. It's like on every budget, you have to re-justify the same thing. And it's like, I understand it from one perspective where the sponsor is checking a box and doesn't, want to get dinged from a fair market value perspective, right? Or that they're paying this site more so that they want to do their due diligence. But what I don't understand, if you agree to an administrative fee of X amount on August 31st, then on September 20th, the site should not need to re-justify that administrative fee amount to you on a different study. You should have a mechanism by which, maybe annually on a site basis or whatever, you're saying, okay, this price for this thing has been justified. So if they ask for this again, it's good to go. They don't need to re-justify it.
It's so funny that you should say that because this was something I was well aware of happened. But now that we're having this conversation, I just realize how silly that sounds because it's like if you're working with any other contractor in any other industry and any other circumstance, and they have a rate card or however they do business, and you do a project with them 3 weeks prior, you're not going to then go and do a whole rigmarole of renegotiating and have them essentially defend their rate the second time, right? You would say, okay, that you're X $100 an hour or whatever the cost is, or this is the fixed cost for this kind of project. Okay, just move on, right?
Yeah. And it's so that's something that sponsors can do better. And I think, sponsors need to realize that fair market value sites don't care about. It doesn't mean anything to the site that on average they're more expensive than their peers in a geographic region. That doesn't do anything for the site's costs. The site's costs are what they are. The fact that the hospital over there is cheaper. Well, great. Go do the study at that other hospital then. I don't know what to tell you about that. And so stop pretending like fair market value matters. That should be solely an internal tool you use for yourself
Right.
to determine, how out of pocket. But the amount of times they're saying to the site, justify this to me, it doesn't fall in fair market value. It's like, I don't know, like this, that has nothing to do with me as an individual site, what the fair market value in my geographic region is at this point in time for this particular study.
Is that because they want to negotiate that, or is it because they need a CYA for compliance reasons? I feel like that might...
I think it's both. If I had to guess, I think I would hope, maybe I'm being naive here, that the primary driver is CYA. But I can't imagine there is not also an impetus for financial savings, right? Because it's, well, you get a lower price, you save money. Who doesn't like that? Like, let's just be real about it.
I guess if we had to say anything though, it's, sponsors / CROs, please just store these rates somewhere, some database, store the justification for those rates somewhere in some database, so you're not constantly getting people to do this every time.
Sponsor, if you have multiple CROs, when you do it with one CRO on one study and you get it justified, you need to have a mechanism by which you can roll that out across your... And guess what? Your gastroenterology department might have to talk to your neurology department sponsor. Like, that happens a lot of the time where these different disease groups that sponsors are completely siloed.
Yeah.
And just like how I was saying at the site, where you need to do harmonization of staff time across different studies and things of that nature, the sponsors need to be doing that same thing, right? And when they learn something via one CRO in one disease area, they need to have a mechanism by which they can extrapolate that across their organization.
I think there were some really, really good learning lessons here. I hope that everyone has learned a lot. And I think when I think about the conversation to date, a couple of points that stand out to me are, one, at the very beginning of the study, just think about your risks. Do you really need to negotiate all these lines of the CDA? Think about the specific points that really matter here. Please, protocol writers, consider the logistics of the study, not just the scientific integrity, because that will make everyone's lives so much better. And finally, what we just spoke about, which is please share information. If you're going to work with the same site across your departments, across CROs, have a way of sharing that information. Everyone talks about silos, and I guess we're going to say it here, beating the same drum. But yeah, Ish, it was wonderful having you on today. I hope everyone has learned a lot, and really appreciate having you on the podcast. Is there anything you'd like to tell the audience where they can find you, or any kind of thing coming up for you that you'd like to share?
Sure. I will be speaking at, first of all, thank you for having me. Number one, I enjoyed it. Like I said, people in real life don't have any idea what it is that we do. And so I always enjoy talking to people about it who actually care about learning about what it is that happens in this space. I'll be speaking at Magi at Home coming up here in October. We'll be going over, like I said, common points of contractual conflict on clinical trial agreements and proposing some actual solutions to those. So check that out if you have a chance. And my email, I'm going to plug it, ifekete@hcg.com. If you want to talk about anything related to study activation or contract negotiation, I'm here for it. Just reach out. Happy to have a conversation.
Sounds good. And those will all be put in the show notes. All right, Ish. With that, goodbye, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice.